Janett Reyna was a lovely young lady from Oklahoma, USA. She is a sweet, caring police officer who adored her job. She was appointed director of the domestic violence program for the region's Native American tribes in 2012. Janett's co-workers looked up to her because she was so good at her job. She helped over 60 victims of domestic violence find shelters, therapy, work, and other essential resources. People adored her for her cheerful and kind demeanor, and they opened up to her almost immediately. She was also so friendly that she would go out of her way to assist anyone in need. Janett had a warm family as well. She and her long-term partner had 3 loving children who meant the world to her. Everyone thought Janett had a perfect life and deserved nothing but the best. They had no idea that her life was far from perfect. Luis Frias was Janett's long-term partner. They met in college and hit it off right away. While Janett's mother was initially skeptical of Luis, their bond eventually won her over. Luis and Janett never married, but they'd been together long enough to be considered common-law partners. Everyone thought they were the ideal couple. Janett had family photos all over her house. Luis would send her flowers and gifts to her workplace, and he was especially attentive to her when she was pregnant. They were always laughing and having a good time. Janett, on the other hand, felt the same pain as her victims behind closed doors. And, like the majority of victims, she kept it to herself. Janett applied to be a police officer at the Blackwell Police Department in Oklahoma in 2007. Before she could join the force, she had to pass a series of tests. The selection committee was concerned about Janett's family life, even though she passed her tests. Luis and his mother both had a criminal record, albeit for minor infractions. Nonetheless, their records had no effect on Janett's scores, and they proceeded with her application. Luis was extremely cooperative and excited for Janett when officers arrived at her home for verification. His attitude shifted as soon as she got the job. He seemed to do everything he could to prevent her from joining the force and make her life as difficult as possible. Few people were aware of Luis' shift in attitude. Those who knew him thought he was envious of Janett's progress. Janett was a dedicated officer who took her job seriously. Luis, on the other hand, would complain about her and how she didn't care about her family. He didn't want Janett to become an independent, strong woman. Luis' interference was so strong that Janett resigned from her job in 2008. He abused and tortured her so severely that Janett obtained protective orders against him several times. But, like any other manipulative partner, Luis would persuade Janett that he had changed his mind, and she would cancel the order. It was a never-ending cycle. Janett was having difficulty processing the situation. On the one hand, Luis was ruining her life, on the other, he was the father of her children, and she didn't want to split them up. Janett eventually joined the Department of Domestic Violence in 2012, nearly 4 years after leaving the police force. Despite having the same problem at home, she was proud to have assisted so many Ponca women. Luis disliked her work because she appeared more independent. He only wanted her to be under his control. So he hacked into her phone and installed spyware, as well as placing tracking devices in her car and office. He also kept breaking into her office to find information about her. Janett had no idea Luis was following her every move. While she thought it was strange that he always knew where she was, she had no idea he was following her. However, while cleaning the house one day, she discovered discarded boxes of tracking devices, and she realized he was spying on her. Janett then went through her belongings to find and dispose of the devices. Nonetheless, she was unable to confront him. Janett had had enough by 2013. She needed to get away from Luis, so she obtained yet another protective order. This time, however, she stuck to her decision. She relocated with her children to a new apartment. Luis had no idea where she had gone or if she was even in town. It enraged him because he was losing control of his family and desired to reclaim it. He kept calling Janett, threatening her parents, and using dubious methods to locate her. However, nothing worked. Janet receives a phone call from Louise's mother a few weeks later. She phoned to see if she could meet her grandchildren. She hadn't seen them in a long time, and she missed them. Janet agreed because she felt sympathetic. This was nothing new for Janet. She allowed her children to spend time with their grandmother on a regular basis in order to foster a relationship. Furthermore, Louise did not stay with his mother, who thought it was safe. So Janet, her co-worker Monique, and the children went to Louise's mother's house. Janet found a parking spot a few blocks away and the two of them walked the rest of the way. Monique noticed Janet and the kids leave for the apartment. She overheard Janet and the grandmother conversing in Spanish. Janet later said her goodbyes to the kids and turned to leave. She then heard a scream from inside the apartment. Louise dragged Janet and the kids inside and slammed the door shut. All of this happened in an instant, and Monique was terrified. Neither she nor Janet were aware that Louise was present. He and his mother appeared to have planned the ambush, and Janet was in big trouble. Monique panicked and looked for her phone. However, it was in the car. So she dashed to her car to retrieve her phone and dialed 911. She then rushed to give them the address because she was unfamiliar with the area. All of this squandered valuable time that would cost Janet everything. A horrific scene was unfolding inside the apartment as Monique tried to get help. Louise was assaulting Janet in front of their children. Their 7-year-old daughter noticed her mother was in pain and dialed 911 for assistance. Louise's mother, however, cut the call before she could reach an operator. Monique was on the phone with the 911 operator when she told them she couldn't hear Janet's screams any longer. She was about to enter the building when she noticed Louise running out of it. She realized right away that something was wrong. Monique's worst fears were confirmed when she entered the apartment. Monique could smell the nauseating odor of blood even before she entered the apartment. When she entered the house, she discovered her friend dead in a pool of blood. The grandmother and the children were not present. Monique began sobbing uncontrollably. She was terrified to see her friend in such a state. Louise's mother heard her cries and began yelling at her in Spanish. Monique realized the woman was threatening her even though she didn't understand what she said. As a result, she exited the building and waited for the police to arrive. When the cops entered the apartment, they recognized the victim right away as Janet. The officers were aware of the former officer's problems with her partner. Louise's mother confessed to the crime as the officers recovered from their initial shock and began studying the crime scene. However, the police were already aware that Louise was a suspect in the murder. The cops then found the kids and asked Monique to look after them. One of the children informed Monique that she needed to change her clothes because she had wet herself after witnessing her father stabbing her mother with a knife. Louise, it turns out, had dragged Janet into the apartment and stabbed her up to 41 times. He didn't mind that his children were witnessing the gruesome scene. He simply wanted to vent his rage on Janet. The cops were now looking for Louise. They notified all police stations and media outlets. They also followed and confirmed the numerous tips they received. According to one source, Louise was with his family in Enid, Oklahoma, about an hour away from his mother's house. However, by the time the police arrived, he had already left. The police discovered that Louise had asked a friend to assist him in leaving the state. He'd been dropped off by a friend in Wichita, Kansas. However, by the time the police arrived at the scene, he was no longer there. The police in Kansas received information that Louise had boarded a bus bound for West Texas. He had escaped by the time the police arrived and checked the bus. Only this time, the cops had no idea when or where he got out. While the police were looking for Louise, they tracked down the people who helped him flee. These individuals, along with Louise's mother, were charged as murder accomplices. While Louise's mother attempted to accept full responsibility for the crime, the police were not convinced. They knew Louise was to blame for Janett Reyna's death, and she deserved justice. However, Because the mother assisted Luis in committing the crime, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Years passed, and the police had no idea where Luis was. The case was quickly becoming cold. As a result, the police added Luis' information to the U.S. Marshal's 15 most wanted fugitives list, and they asked the public for assistance in tracking him down. A $25,000 reward for reliable information was also announced. However, it wasn't until 5 years later, in 2019, when a TV show called In Pursuit covered the story, that they received a reliable tip. According to the tip, Luis was hiding in Mexico under a false identity. The police then collaborated with Mexican authorities to extradite Luis to the United States. To add a symbolic touch, he was brought to court handcuffed with Janet's handcuffs. Luis did not contest the accusations in court, and he pleaded guilty to Janett Reyna's murder. He claimed he was sorry for his actions and that he committed the crime in a fit of rage. He also claimed that he adored Janet and his children with all of his heart. But the cops, Janet's family, and the judge had had enough. He did it for power and control, they knew. Janet's family had the option of facing the death penalty or life in prison. They chose life in prison without the possibility of parole because they did not want to relive the horrific events. Luis was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Janett Reyna. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years, for conspiring with his mother to entice Janet into the apartment. Luis' mother was released after serving 6 years of a 20-year sentence. Luis' mother was released in February 2020 due to. What are your thoughts on the Janett Reyna's case? I really appreciate your input. Thank you for taking the time to watch. Be a part of the Chris Crime Diaries family and hit the subscribe button now.